Hello everyone, and welcome to the 1.3 version of the Pro mounting system for Unreal Engine. There's a lot of changes going on in the mounting system, and that's going to slowly feed on over into the 2.0 release that I plan on launching in the next major release of Unreal Engine, which should be 4.25. So a lot of changes that have been made are going into a sort of transitional version of this plugin, which will be released for the 4.24 release of Unreal Engine 4. The main reason for this is to not break anyone currently using the plugin, as I have come across several issues that kind of complicate things when adding the deprecation flag to interfaces, especially ones that get called by the internal workings of a component. So for that reason, the release of these updates are going to be rolled out over about 2 different versions to 3 different versions of the engine. The first one, which I kind of call soft deprecation, will be cleaning up old functions and gently deprecating them by putting them into a deprecation category. And then the next major engine release will actually apply the deprecation flag to those functions on the interfaces. And then finally, the third release, which is the final step to this, those functions will be completely removed from the plugin. So you have some time to make the upgrades and the adjustments, and I'll go over what those are in these tutorials. So with that, let's start taking a look. Okay, so this is the code version of the example project that I have provided. This is the main project that I actually program off of in order to develop the plugin. So you have access to this. The only thing is when you download this, there's a link that's always provided in all the videos so you can download all of these projects. There's a blueprint version and a code version. I work in the code version because it's easier to develop the plugin in there. All the example projects do not come with the plugin, so you're going to need that plugin before you use it. But if you have the plugin installed in your Unreal Engine, or if you have it on your custom source engine, then it should work fine. It's already got the connection. It's already got the connection to the plugin itself listed for both the blueprint version and the C++ version. So truthfully, all this project is a third-person template project, and that is it. Even the source code here is just the third-person template project. The main thing you get is what's in the content folder. So with these projects, I give you a really awful looking robot horse that has no real animations of its own, but it's a great stand-in for an actual mount from a visual appearance as a horse. You also get a left mounting animation and a left mounting animation and a left dismounting animation. There are right mounting and right dismounting animations, but I got a little lazy on those, and so they're not the best. They don't look quite as well as the left side mounting and left side dismounting. You might be able to trick them out by creating some kind of mirror for those, but ultimately this entire tutorial is just going to be based around getting off and on the horse. Another thing you can do to follow along is you can set up the third-person template and then add in the vehicle system, and then you can use the little go-kart that Unreal Engine provides you for mounting. I've actually set up I've actually set this up, so you guys might be getting an updated version of this project with the go-kart in it already. We'll see how that goes. Okay, so with the project open, the starting project. Again, this is the starting project, not the finished project. With the starting project open, we have the third-person map here. We have the mannequin. And then we have mounting content, the robot horse that I have made. So what we're first going to do is create our basic classes. Okay, so what we're going to do now is set up our base classes that we're going to do. Well, this means creating the horse, creating our character that we control, creating some basic interfaces, creating the game mode, and maybe creating a spawner for our mount. It's a pretty simple thing to do. Also a player controller. After that, we're going to set up the interfaces, and then we're going to set up the components. And then the last thing we're going to do, probably in the next video after this is a setup video, the next video, which is hooking all that up, we're going to be actually connecting the interfaces and the components together. So let's start by setting up our basic classes that we're going to need. Create a new blueprint class. Call it third person character. That's going to be BP mounting character. Again, this is our third person character. Bring this over here. As you can see, just inherits straight from our third person C++ class. If you're running the blueprint version of this, it's going to be the same thing, third person character, except you're going to have it in blueprint form. And then we're going to create another one. Third person character. BP horse. Save all that. So the horse, we're going to go to the mesh and rename that to change that to robot horse. There we go. Now let's create the game mode. Then create player controller. Call it mounting player controller. Actually, for consistency's sake, because we're going to call it just player controller. This is what the released project files are going to look like. So if you're following this along, you'll keep consistent with the final project files. And then let's create our interfaces we're going to need. Blueprints. Blueprint interface. I always name them BPI. And it'll be, we're going to call this interactable actor. Really all this is going to be for later. This is not a necessary part of setting up the mounting system. But for this tutorial, we're going to be setting up sort of a pretty rudimentary and simplified interaction system. If you have your own interaction system, the mounting system should work perfectly fine with it. All you'll need to do is call one function to kick everything off for your interaction system. We're just kind of creating our own interaction system for this tutorial. All right, so open up the game mode. Go to controller. I'm going to say BP player controller. Go to the pawn, default pawn. We're going to say mounting character. I believe that's it. We just need those two things. Now on our world settings for this map, I'm going to set it to this game mode. So now when I load up, this should be my mounting character. There it is. We can test it and see that the mounting character did in fact spawn here. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be setting up is the combination of the interfaces and the components that go with them. First things first, let's begin with the horse. So under component, we're going to add the mountable pawn component. There it is. Click that. And I always like to keep the name component on them. Compile and save. Okay. So this component is attached to anything that needs to be a mount. Its primary job is to define the seats, their mountable positions and dismountable positions, and what socket the character should attach to that represents that seat. So now we need to add the interfaces to the mount. There are two interfaces that every mount needs. Go to Class Settings. The first interface is what I call a unified pawn controller interface. What this does is allows you to treat the pawns and the controller as kind of a single entity instead of two separate things. You can also, no matter what object or pawn or actor that you get, as long as they implement this interface, you can retrieve using the unified controller pawn interface. You can retrieve the mount, you can retrieve the pawn, your original pawn, the character that you are supposed to be controlling, and then you can retrieve the controller from any one of these things. So the first interface will be this unified controller pawn. And all three of the classes will have this. The next one we're going to add is the mountable pawn interface. Let me compile and save. Now, for sanity's sake, I have set up every single function on the mountable pawn interface and the ADM unified controller pawn interface so that they show up here in this drop-down. The alternative is having to go through here, add an event, and then look for the IADM unified controller pawn here, and then this is where you would have to set it up. Instead of having this kind of two areas where you need to find functions to implement, they're all going to be right here. So under the interfaces and then the name of the interface. As you can see, the unified pawn controller is fairly concise, whereas the mountable pawn has quite a few functions. But don't get overwhelmed by that, because almost all of these functions correlate with some function of the mountable pawn component. This was one of the design philosophies that I used for this, where the components use the interfaces. There's no hard cast to any specific type of actor other than pawn. Pawn is the only catch here, where if you want to possess something, it has to be a pawn. And I believe that is pretty much just part of the Unreal Engine, honestly. But it does assume that the actor that you're passing in will be a pawn. And then beyond that, any other functionality is going to be implemented through these interfaces. And so by doing that, I was able to basically create a system that is pretty agnostic to whatever objects and classes that you are going to be using for your game or your software that you're building that requires things to be mounted. Okay, so the next class we're going to be setting up is the mounting character. It's pretty similar to how you set up the actual horse. So the first thing you're going to do is add the mount rider component. There it is. Mount rider component. And again, I like to keep the component part on there. You can name it whatever you want, but I think it makes it fairly clear. The purpose of the mount rider component is to kind of keep track of the state of this particular character, whether it's mounted, not mounted, what it's mounted to. It also controls the events of getting on, getting off a mount or in and out of a vehicle. The next thing we're going to do is add the interfaces for it. So go to Class Settings. Again, we're going to add the unified controller pawn. And just to kind of show you what those functions do, because I talked about them for the horse. As you can see, it has a few functions here for starting and stopping mounting, but these three functions are at the core. Get character pawn, get mount, and get controller. These allow us to always get the correct actor that we're looking for. If you're trying to get your pawn, then you want to get, this guy, then you want to call this pawn. If he's mounted and you want to get the mount, then you can call the mount. Or if you need the controller, even when the controller is not possessing this particular character, the component here keeps a reference of the player controller that was, or not the player controller, but the original controller that was possessing it. So this should also work with AI characters that need to be repossessed by their AI component. But this function will always get the original controller that was possessing the character here. The next interface that you need to add will be the Mount Rider interface. So the Mount Rider interface is basically going to be implemented almost completely by this Rider component. Every function here has an analog to the Mount Rider component functions themselves. And as I said with the horse, this basically allows the components to call the interface functions rather than perform hard cast to either a blueprint or a C++ class, and completely removes any requirement for you to inherit some weird class that you don't want to inherit from, or reconfigure your system and your game to fit whatever I may have had in mind for it. Okay. So the last class we're going to set up is the player controller. Double click that. Here, we're going to add the Mount Rider controller component. Again, I'm just going to add component. You don't have to add that. I like to add it. It's my own personal thing. Okay. So just like all the others, go to class settings. And again, we're going to add unified controller pawn. And again, when we get to the actual implementation of all these things, I think this is going to make more sense if you don't quite understand it just yet. But for now, this is just our basic setup, get everything ready for implementing these interfaces. So we added the unified controller pawn. Next, we're going to add the Mount Rider controller interface. Just like the Mount Rider interface and the mountable pawn interface, this interface's job is specifically to interface with the Rider controller component. And as you can see, compared to the other two specialized interfaces, it is a lot less daunting. So compile, save, and that's it for basic setup. Okay, so now what we're going to do is set up our horse's skeleton so that there are places for our characters to sit. This is the same process you would do for any mount thing that you want your character to sit on. You just need a way to identify a place for that character to sit. And the best way to do that is sockets. So for the robot horse, this is going to be under Mesh, and I need to open the skeleton. And then we'll move this here so you can kind of see it better. So this is going to be a two-seater mount, which means you're going to have a character who can sit here and a character who can sit here. Ideally, they'll be able to mount from the left or the right side of either one of these positions. And I'm going to show you how to set all that up later. That's all part of the mountable character system. But this part is literally just setting this up so that the mountable character, our horse blueprint, knows and understands the skeleton. Spine 3 is going to be the root bone for our driver's seat, and spine 2 is going to be the bone for our passenger seat. So for spine 3, I'm going to right click and say add socket. And then this socket I'm going to name S_driver's seat. And the spine 2 bone, I'm going to add socket. And this one's going to be called S_passenger seat. So now the bones here are a little bit funky because I build them in Blender, so the rotations kind of Blender, the way it works, the rotations you can't always trick out like you can in Maya. But I build everything in Blender because I love Blender. So I'm going to tweak these positions here so that they kind of line up properly and that the player, whenever they are attached to socket, attaches without any kind of weird calculations. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in some magic numbers that I've already tweaked and messed with. So it might take a little bit of work if you're using your own special character for this. You know, if the bones are rotated a little funky like you see here, were I to attach a character here, they would literally be sitting straight up, but in this weird diagonal kind of way. So to fix that, I need to rotate this -34 degrees and -90. And then here, -11, because I want to move it up. So we're going to push it forward just a wee bit, and then we're going to move it up 20. So now, when the driver takes the seat, he should be sitting straight up, and his butt should be firmly planted right around here. We're going to do a similar thing for the passenger seat. It's fairly in a good position as it is, so all I need to do is rotate it -90 degrees. And then I need to move it up just a wee bit, forward about 2 inches, and then up 18 units. So now the passenger will be firmly planted right there. Save. And that's all for setting up the horse for now. Well, that's all for setting up the horse's skeleton for now. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is take a look at the animations that I have set up for this. So we go to mannequin and animations. I have created 4 animations for mounting and dismounting. One for mounting to the left, one for dismounting to the left, one for mounting to the right, and one for dismounting to the right. Now, it's kind of tricky to set up animations for the mannequin in Blender, or at least I have found that way, because I can't really use IKs very well in Blender for this particular mannequin. Someone else may have figured out a way to do this. I would love to know, but because of that, I literally only have the mount left and dismount left animations working. The right animations function properly, they just don't look as good. So as an example, here's the mount right. As you can see, kind of have him, he grabs the animal, throws his leg over, and then sits down. Looks great. If I go to the mount right, I literally just kind of blend the finished state with the starting state. So one day I may fix this and set this up and have it working just like the left side mount and dismount, but for all intents and purposes, it functions properly. So the next thing I'm going to point out is we're not going to set up anything crazy with these montages. I am going to show you how to set up the animation blueprint a little bit. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the locomotion animation, funnel it through a slot, and that slot will be the default slot, so the entire body will be affected by this. The main thing to know about the animations that is used with these montages is do not use root motion. Unless you're making a single player game, do not use root motion. For multiplayer games where you need to have mounting and dismounting animations, root motion really messes up some things. And I explained this in an animation video that I did for the previous version, which is still completely relevant, and you can go check that out. If you're making a multiplayer game, do not use root motion. If you're making a single player game, it really doesn't matter. But for multiplayer games, you have this annoying equation of user input allowing you to move around, plus lag between the client and the server, plus one actor now being attached to another actor. And what ends up happening is this weird offset is created because of that lag between input being sent to the server and the client and you moving and all this stuff. It creates a weird offset where the character's kind of floating to the left, to the right, the back, or a little too forward. Something like that. And it's completely based on, it's something in Unreal, and it's completely based on that lag differential. So for multiplayer games, just avoid root motion for doing this. There are ways to create the animations where it attaches the component, it attaches the capsule to the mount, and then it looks like root motion is occurring and you're getting on the mount and all is good. That's the way I suggest doing it in my animation video that I made for a previous version, and it still is the way to do it. So moving on, we're going to take a look at the animation blueprint next. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is create another third-person anim blueprint by right-clicking this, and we're going to duplicate it. And I always name these as ABP underscore mounting character. We're going to open this up. And you see, this is the basic animation blueprint for our character. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable called isMounted. I don't like question marks in my variable names. That's dumb. So isMounted is basically going to be a flag that says whether or not this character is mounted. And actually, that's not entirely true because we're going to be using a different function. Because really the question is, are we seated? Tooltips are different. So are we seated on the mount or not? I'm going to leave this as is mounted for now because the finished animation blueprint in the finished project, I'm not going to change any of that, but the finished animation blueprint that you can download is going to use the variable isMounted. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to set the isMounted variable. I'm going to say, okay, let's just make sure this is not read only. I don't know why that happened. All right, so grab this, set. So we're getting the owner pawn here, and I'm just going to break this down like so. And we're going to call the interface function is seated on mount. Connect the lines. And what this will do is this will actually call up to the owner as an interface. It's going to get the variable if it's seated or not, if it's currently sitting on the horse, which is all taken care of by the mount rider component. Once we set all that up, and then we'll be good to go here. So with that out of the way, the next thing we're going to take a look at is the animation graph itself. As you can see, it has a default state machine connecting to the output graph. Now this is going to change a lot. So first thing we're going to do is disconnect this. Bring that back over here. We're going to cache this pose. We're going to call this locomotion. Right click, use cached pose locomotion. And then we're going to feed this through a slot. And so what this will do is If the mounting or dismounting montage, or actually any montage, is running through the default slot, that animation will completely override anything that comes out of this state machine here. So this is going to take over the whole body of the character. There are advanced ways to use this for, maybe only using half the body and things like that, but that's not what we're going to do here. This is just going to be, if we're running the dismount or mounting animation, take over the whole animation. Okay, so next, go into here, and what we're going to do is we're going to copy all of this and cut it. Then we're going to create a new state called on ground states. And then here we're going to create a new state machine. Call this ground states. Connect that there. So in here, we're going to paste all of those states that we had copied out earlier. Connect them here. So now, by default, if we go back to here, into the state machine, the entry point is going to go straight to the grounds, and then grounds is going to run this sub-state machine here, which is all of our basic animations for our mannequin character. Now go back to default. We're going to create another state called on mounted states. And then we're going to create a transition back to the ground states. So anytime the character is in a mounted state, it's going to go over to the unmounted states. And then when it gets out of the mounted state, it's going to go back to the ungrounded states. And that transition is pretty simple. We're looking for, are we mounted? Or in this case, are we mounted and are we seated? Go back here. Is mounted, get, and then we're going to get the not boolean. Connect that there. And voila. So, going back into the unmounted states, we're going to create another state machine. Although technically this state machine is not going to be as complicated as the normal on ground state machines, it could be more complicated. So I tend to build things in a fairly flexible way, as flexible as I can make them. So you might have other states required for your idle mounted, which will be our first state, or you might have other things you can do while mounted. So to handle that, we'll do create a state, and we'll call it idle mounted. And idle mounted is pretty simple for us because all it's going to do is play our mounted animation. If we go to the animation preview, if I check mounted on, as you can see, our character assumes this state of being mounted on top of something. Okay, so that's it for setting up our basic animation blueprint. So that is it for part 1 of the tutorial series. This was just laying down the foundation that we're going to need for the next part, which will be hooking up the components into the interfaces. If you're building your own system and you're not following along with these video tutorials, then part 2 is probably where you should have started. Part 2 is where the meat and bones of this entire system are going to lie. So once we're finished with part 2, the actual functional implementation of the mounting system is actually going to be completely done. The only thing we'll have to do after that is hook up your interaction system with the mounting system. Otherwise, we're also going to continue on in a part 3 of this video showing how to hook up a very basic interaction system so that we can kick off and trigger the whole mounting system properly.